Railway Conversations with Doc Frank.
Hey, I'm Doc Frank. Welcome to my podcast where every week I'm presenting you authentic, spontaneous and unrehearsed discussions with interesting guests from the rail industry about topics that matter. Make sure you subscribe and tell your friends about it, as this podcast will both educate and entertain them. Thank you for listening. Welcome to a new episode of Railway Conversations with Doc Frank. My guest today is Peter Thornton from Sydney in Australia. Peter has been a railway consulting for most of his career for several decades, and he's got some very reasonable views on some of the major rail infrastructure projects in Australia. We are talking about Sydney Metro and the planning for that. And we're also covering areas of regional fast rail in Australia, which is rail connections between the major cities and regional subcenters, and also the elephant in the room, the high-speed railway along the Australian east coast. I hope you enjoy. Hi, it's Doc Frank. Real quick. If you are a fan of communications-based train control or short CBTC, there's an event coming up in September that you absolutely don't want to miss. It's the first virtual global CBTC conference. It's called CBTC World Summit 2023, and it's happening on the 20th and the 21st of September. There will be 3 sessions of about 6 hours duration each for 3 different global regions, one for Asia Pacific, one's for North and South America, and one's for Europe and the Middle East. So wherever you are in the world, one of those sessions will be during the daytime in your time zone, and you can watch it live for the full 6 hours with 6 presentations. The kicker about this is that all other presentations, including the ones from your own session, will be available for replay via recordings. So that means that if the other session should be in the middle of your night, you can still watch it on demand at a time that's more convenient for you and doesn't interfere with your good night's sleep. The conference is available for registration right now at my training portal under docfranktraining.podia.com/summit23. I repeat that, docfranktraining.podia.com/summit23. I'm putting a lot of effort into this conference. It will be an absolute blockbuster event, and I very much hope to see you there. Peter, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks, Frank. It's a pleasure to come and have a chat to you.
Great. We're going back for quite a few years. We used to work both at Wally Parsons for a time. I think in your case, the consulting career goes even further back than this. You worked for several other consultancies in Australia, but also in London and in Hong Kong, if I saw this correctly on your profile. And recently you did a post on LinkedIn which caught my interest, and I thought we start talking about that. And that was related to the strategy for Sydney Metro, whether they're setting the right priorities, whether they're building the right lines, how they connect the lines or not connect the lines. So maybe you just start stating your views again, so that the listeners who haven't seen your post on that or may not recall what you posted there get a little bit of a background where you're coming from.
Thanks, Frank. Well, I guess first some background, I suppose, and I'm not quite sure which of my many posts or letters to the editor you're referring to, because I've written quite a few. Look, I suppose to cut to the chase on it, I think that they are building the wrong railway to Western Sydney Airport. And I say that with more than 25 years' experience in the matter. And I suppose that part of the problem is that one always has a bit of a prejudice, because in 1991, I drew a direct line from Parramatta to Western Sydney Airport on a map, which sort of implies that my view is that we should be linking a major CBD like Parramatta, and like Parramatta is going to become, because one of the things really we need to do is to reinforce Parramatta as a true second CBD within the Cumberland Plain, which to date it really hasn't done. Back in 1991, we were talking about job employment in Parramatta needed to get to 80,000 jobs compared with something like 220,000 jobs in the Sydney CBD. Now, if you roll the clock on a little bit further to where we are now, we've had the Greater Sydney Commission, I think it was called, who came up with this idea of three cities, the Western Parkland City, which is focused on Western Sydney Airport, Parramatta, or the city, I think they call it, and really, well, it's the Sydney CBD. And it just seems to me that in transport planning, if you don't have a high-speed link that links the three most important centres in your metropolis, then you've really created a problem. And what we've seen is that the government has decided to invest billions of dollars, I forget the number off the top, what was it, $11 billion, something like that, in building a link from Western Sydney Airport to St Mary's, whereupon you will have to change to take a train to somewhere. Now, I think this government and the previous government has become quite obsessed with metros as the solution to everything. I seriously question that. I think that $11 billion would have been far better spent providing a fast link from Western Sydney Airport and the Aerotropolis that they're proposing to build to Parramatta. I mean, certainly if at a later date you wanted to build that northern connection and continue that connection up to join the other metro further north, well, that's fine as well, because actually there's an interesting statistic that I came across, or I actually generated for another client originally in Auckland when I was working on the Auckland City Railway. And we did a benchmarking study which looked at how many railways that point or provide access to a CBD does the city need. The remarkable thing is it's pretty much a straight line between Wellington with a population of around 1 million to Beijing with a population of a lot more. And what it turns out is that straight line says that you need one railway line for every 250,000 people in that CBD. So you could argue that if Western Sydney focused on the Aerotropolis is to be a population of 1 million people, that's certainly the numbers that we're talking about, then it's not unreasonable that there are 4 railways that point at that. But I think we also have to look at Western Sydney Airport. I also, in addition to my work on railways, I also led a team that proved that Badgerys Creek was the best paid place for another airport. That was a piece of work that I did with the Commonwealth. I led the engineering and environmental planning team, which, if you like, had to find a site for Western Sydney for another airport. And what we did was we ended up affirming that Badgerys Creek really was, of all the places you could go to, still the best site after all of this time. And that really allowed the minister to put his hand on his heart and say, look, trust me, I've done the work, I've looked everywhere. There may be 1 or 2 other places where we could put an airport, but really the best place is Badgerys Creek. It mightn't be the world's greatest airport site, but it's the best one we've got going for us. And as a result of that, one of the things that I was concerned about, there's a lot of evidence to show that, is that to make an airport really successful, you need to have the very best land transport connections. And I think what I've been surprised about is that since I left that team, and I suppose if I did anything on it, in the next phase of that work was that I did ask that there be 4 tracks running through the airport site, 2 pairs of tracks. I was pretty much inspired by looking at a number of airports around the world, particularly, for example, Berlin's New Berlin Airport, very interesting, where they're able to run rail links to and from. So it really reinforced my mind that to make Western Sydney Airport successful, really needed to link major centres Sydney Basin. And those major centres are not St Mary's, but those major centres are Parramatta, Sydney CBD. Well, I also did some other work, which is reported on my website, to benchmark airports and airport rail links around the world. And essentially what I found out of that was that almost certainly people within that ring of cities, from Penrith, St Mary's, Parramatta, Liverpool, Campbelltown, they will use road-based transport to access the airport. So if the airport's going to be successful, and from a railway perspective, it needs to address the biggest possible markets, and in my view, that's Parramatta and CBD. So, you know, I think I've lost the argument, because I read the other day that one of the tunnel boring machines has actually broken through into the airport. But I think that building that link, and for that to be a fast link into Sydney CBD, is really going to be essential. Now, I'm afraid that leads on to the next criticism, is that I don't think that the link that they're proposing for the Western Metro to Parramatta, again, I don't think that's up to the job, because it doesn't really provide for high-speed running, which is the sort of thing you need to make it successful. My estimation was that you would need to deliver a travel time from Sydney CBD of around 35 minutes if you want that airport rail link to be competitive. And it won't do that if you have a sort of stopping metro that is currently being proposed. And nor do I think that there is, what I've been able to see, is that there is adequate planning for a Sydney terminal that's set up to provide access to the airport. So there's some worries there. My view is that if we had done as, well, the government had done as I suggested, and take a good hard look at the Hong Kong airport railway, that we'd end up with a much better sort of system, and one that really would support Western Sydney Airport to become a really viable second airport, which after all is what the Commonwealth wants, because almost certainly at some point, when all the construction risks and the patronage risks have been taken, the government will put this airport on the market, just as it did with Sydney Airport. So I'm just disappointed, I suppose, Frank, that we haven't looked and tried to do something a lot better than we're currently doing.
Yeah. Well, there are different views that you can have on that. Number one is I tend to look at the network planning, the overall network planning for Sydney Metro. And one example of that was that in the future, it was planned that the Western Sydney Airport line continues up north to eventually meet Sydney Metro Northwest, somewhere between St Mary's and Kachagong, which is the current terminus of Sydney Metro Northwest. And the Western Sydney Airport line was also meant to be extended down south all the way down to Campbelltown and MacArthur, which would open up this access area in line with what you said. The problem with this probably is that you need to think about when will this eventuate, this network plan, whether it will be eventuate at all, and in what time frame, and what's the situation in the meantime. So for the time being, the way that the Western Sydney Airport line is currently built, it will terminate in St Mary's, where passengers can transfer to the Sydney train system, which will go from there into Parramatta and also out to the west towards Penrith and then further into the Blue Mountains. But from the concept of the three cities, as you said, where Sydney CBD is one, Parramatta is the second, and the third one is more like a conglomeration of cities, including Penrith and including Campbelltown. St Mary's seems to be in the middle of everything, which means it's not in any of those places directly. It does always require a change, not just a change of lines, it also requires a change of transport mode, which in the case of Sydney Trains and Sydney Metro is quite different, which you can see in Chatswood, for example, where both services depart from the same platform, just on different sites. And And yes, I'm not quite sure how this will work in the future, how smoothly that will work. But I can understand that that people, not just yourself, but other people could say, well, maybe that could have done a bit more efficient, and maybe it would have been a better option to connect this straight to Parramatta. I think there are also future plans to connect Sydney Metro West, which goes from Sydney, or which is planned to go from Sydney to Parramatta, continuing that line beyond Parramatta to Westmead, and then eventually also have an interchange with the Western Sydney Airport line. But again, if that is 15, 20 years away, or maybe even longer, there is a very long intermediate period where this public transport towards Western Sydney Airport needs to be solved in a different way. And that different way may be, well, not the most convenient for passengers.
Well, I think that's entirely the problem, Frank. That's exactly what I'm saying. Is that what we don't want to do is what we don't want to have is Western Sydney Airport being unsuccessful. We want to have a successful airport, and that it's an airport that actually serves the needs of the people. My view is that with all the money that's gone into road upgrading, and given the relatively smaller populations of those cities, Campbelltown, Liverpool, working your way around that arc, that accessibility to the airport will be driven by people driving or taking express buses from well-defined places. For example, people coming down from the Blue Mountains would be better off to change to a specialised airport bus at Penrith, and then accessing the airport that way. I think that rail transport, my view on rail transport is that it's not something that we want to have wandering around the countryside, which is why I'm a bit concerned about what's being proposed in Melbourne at the moment with their sort of orbital railway. I'm not really convinced that orbital railways work. The job of rail these days is to move a lot of people between centres of high employment or centres of high residential. It's not to wander around being all things to all people. It's got a very specific job, and it needs to do that job very efficiently. I think that, unfortunately, there is a bit of that everyone has a political view about road and so on. Road transport is incredibly important because of the diversity of trips that it's able to make. Rail is incredibly important because it allows people to move, as fast as possible along a well-defined corridor. And I guess I'm just not convinced. I haven't been convinced that what is being built actually meets those criteria. I also understand that the proposition is now to convert the Leppington line to metro, and therefore people have then changed back onto the heavy system at north of Campbelltown, Glenfield, I guess. I'm just not convinced about that either. People don't like changing. People want, particularly if you're an international traveller, because that's what Western Sydney. I mean, the whole business case for Western Sydney is to grow from 10 million passengers per annum in the near term to 70. Now, I think you've really got to provide the best possible access to that facility that you can, and I think it would have been better. Notwithstanding that you still might build those other links of them. I just think the order in which they're doing it is the wrong way around. And the problem is that I think there's a fairly strong political overlay that's come to play on this. I mean, one of the things I've learned in my career is that we as professionals can give all the best advice that we like, but at the end of the day, politicians do make the decisions. And if for whatever reason they decide to do something else, well, they will. And I think in this case, they've decided to do the wrong thing.
Well, what I would think, and maybe that's a bit of an idealistic view, but what I would normally expect is that for investments of this order of magnitude, you're doing a proper investigation, a proper feasibility, a proper business case, and part of all those activities would be an options analysis where you look at a number of different ways to skin the cat. And then you build arguments and certain criteria. So you try to come up with an objective argument, as objective as possible, to apply certain objective criteria and then identify based on those criteria and their weightings the best possible option. And I don't need to tell you this because that's pretty much common consulting practice, I would guess. Yeah, you can call it multi-criteria analysis. That's one of the tools which you can use for these things. So based on that, I would have thought that the government should be in possession of a document or some kind of paper that explains how the current alignment of Sydney Metro Western Sydney Airport is supposed to work, what the concept is of say upgrading St. Mary's as an interchange, what the future capability and the upgrade of the Western Corridor of Sydney trains will be to accommodate additional passengers, how it will be made as convenient as possible for passengers to change from the metro to the Sydney Trains network, all these kind of things. So basically explaining what the actual scope of the option is, including the surrounding environment, because you can't just drop off a metro line underground in St. Mary's and then say, well, I don't really care how the passengers go up there to reach the platform for the Sydney Trains network. So that then there needs to be some concepts, and you see this in the city, for example, with that connection between Barangaroo and Wynyard Station, where people think about, okay, what's an efficient way for people to get from A to B without having to cross busy streets with traffic lights in an environment where already too many pedestrians are up there. Let's get them underground. Let's find some more efficient way to get from one important point to another important point where you have a connection between two different rail systems, like Wynyard for Sydney Trains and Barangaroo for Sydney Metro City. So I would be surprised if there wasn't an argument that supports the current planning made. And that doesn't necessarily say that you or I would agree with that argument 100%, but at least there would be something where you said, okay, well, on that basis, it does have some merit. You can always see it in another way. You can always say that in order to connect Western Sydney Airport with Parramatta, the easiest way is to have a railway line from one point to the other, which means directly to Parramatta. So there's not much argument against that. But there should be demonstrable reasons why it has been planned the other way, and how in this other way it's planned to get passengers from Western Sydney Airport to Parramatta and from Parramatta to Western Sydney Airport, which agreeably is one of the main connections that you would need to have there. So I'm wondering where the other side of the argument is. Where and this is not just for Sydney Metro, this is pretty much for all the discussions, and we later in this interview we will get to the high-speed line concept along the Australian East Coast, where I'm in much of the discussion I'm missing the common sense of the argument, where people, for example, they just take the distance from one endpoint to the other, then they divide it by the maximum speed that a high-speed system can achieve, and then they say, there's our travel time. Notwithstanding that a high-speed train would have to travel very, very slowly through the suburbs of both Sydney and Melbourne, especially if they are supposed to share a corridor with something else. So unless somebody says there's a dedicated line where trains really can run at 300 kilometers per hour into the city center of Sydney and into the city center of Melbourne, I'm missing the rational argument to make a case for that.
Yeah, let's just go back to the metros, Western Sydney Metro. The fact of the matter is that New South Wales government is terribly secretive and actually doesn't make a lot of reports available, unfortunately, for scrutiny, but they had to make it available to Infrastructure Australia, and Infrastructure Australia said they were building the wrong project. At least they're saying they're building a project that didn't stack up, but that doesn't seem to have, nobody seems to have taken much notice of that, which seems to be the case with a lot of things Infrastructure Australia advise government, because going back to what I said previously, government is entitled to say, yes, we've listened to you, but actually we're going to do this. Now, Frank, in 50 years, 75 years, 100 years' time, it probably will be okay. But, those politicians who make that decision, they'll be long gone, I'll be long gone. And as we know, transport reshapes cities. So that if you can hang around long enough, it'll probably work out okay somehow. I just think that under the current circumstances, to make that airport as valuable as possible, that we've got the order wrong. And unfortunately, we've got the order wrong because there are a lot of voices in this city, powerful voices that have influence, that basically are saying we don't want to see this airport tied to Sydney, to the Sydney CBD. So this is an airport for Western Sydney. Yeah, it is, sure. But we still need to make rational transport planning decisions. Now, the other thing I'd just like to say is, I mentioned earlier that one of the contributions I made to the master plan was to ask that there be provision for 4 tracks. And the reason I did that was because we were thinking, or I was thinking, and the rest of the team agreed, I think that that you need to make provision for both local travel, more regional travel. And I reckon those 4 tracks are the most valuable piece of railway infrastructure in New South Wales, maybe Australia. And I think we have to use them incredibly carefully. And one thing not seeing, maybe we will see it through the future, is the connection of that airport into I desperately don't want to use the word high-speed line because I think too much is hung on the word high-speed. But in order to be able to provide for direct regional access into Western Sydney from the south, maybe even from the north, and so on, and then provide access to the city, I think that's terribly important. So I'm going to be looking very carefully to see whether or not we're making the best and optimal use of that provision within the airport.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, the connection between metro and a high-speed line that, say, connects Sydney down to Melbourne and maybe Canberra and maybe up north to Brisbane as well, I can't really think of any other city where those systems would be like shared or brought together. So the best thing pretty much you can have, because you're effectively talking different transport modes in the same way that you already have different transport modes in Sydney at the moment for rail between the Sydney Trains network and the Sydney Metro network. So anybody not believing this, just put yourself on that 1 or 2 platforms in Chatswood, where you have Sydney Metro operations on the one side of the platform and Sydney Trains operation on the other side of the platform, and you will notice a very clear difference in operational concepts, in passenger behavior, in everything. So, and I think it will be even more extreme for a mode change between Sydney Metro or Sydney Trains on the one hand and a high-speed system which connects a city that's 900 kilometers away. Yeah. So, but also for
well, actually, Frank, let me give you 2 examples. Sorry to interrupt there, but let me give you two examples that I've experienced. And by the way, a lot of this I'm talking to is on my website, in terms of downloads. But take Copenhagen Airport, for example. Copenhagen Airport, which actually isn't that much further out of the city than the current Sydney Airport is. But at Copenhagen Airport, you can either take a metro into Copenhagen, can take a heavy rail line into Copenhagen's mainline station, or you can take a mainline train to Stockholm, which I did. So what you've got is a multiplicity of connections. If you take the new airport in Berlin, you can take a metro into central Berlin, you can take a regional train to other places in Germany, or you can take a train into Poland. So those airports are being set up in such a way as to give people a diversity of opportunities to travel by rail away from the airport. And that's what I think is very important.
Yeah.
There was another comment I wanted to make. So, yes, it was about people interchanging. In some work I did years and years ago, we sort of started to coin the term friction. And my view on that was the more friction you put into a person's journey, then the less they're going to like it. Now, you talked about cross-platform interchange at Chatswood. That is set up quite well. If you look at some of the interchanging that has to take place, say, at Town Hall Station, where people have to take an escalator or stairs or up and over, you're starting to introduce friction. Again, if I can use Hong Kong Airport as an example, it was pointed out to me when I was met at the gate years ago when I went up to Hong Kong by a colleague, and as we walked along, and the next minute we're on a train. And he said, "Did you notice?" And I said, "Did I notice what?" He said, "You didn't go over a single step between the door of the aeroplane and the door of the train." So it was a completely frictionless journey, incredibly comfortable. That's my vision, the sort of interchanging that we need to have. And certainly, again, I was thinking about Western Sydney Airport.
I tend to agree. I mean, the standard thing, especially if an airport is involved, is that people have luggage, in many cases heavy luggage, and in these modern days, you very often have some kind of trolleys with little wheels underneath that you can roll. But you can only roll it if you have a flat surface. The moment you got stairs involved or anything with a step in there, you've got a problem, and then you need to lift those things up. And this is what many passengers brings to their physical limits. Yeah,
that's right. And you know, I just think that it's. I'll come back to Hong Kong Airport again as a model, but. You know, I think people make decisions about what mode to use in all kinds of funny ways. Well, I certainly do. For example, when I used to travel up to Brisbane, and when I used to come out of the door of the Brisbane terminal, if I saw a train standing in the station, I would take a taxi. If there was no train standing in the Brisbane Airport station, I would go and take the train. Why? Well, because I knew it was a 15-minute schedule. I didn't know how long the train had been standing there, but you can be sure that as soon as I got up, started to go up the stairs or up the escalator and cross over the bridge to the railway, the train had pulled out. So, you know, my strange sort of decision-making process was that's how I did it. And of course, because the taxi was it was more expensive, but on the other hand, it was right there. And you know, one of the things I said in my paper about airport planning and airport railway stations is that you've got to make access to the train easier than taking a cab. And you don't make it easier if, like at some airports, you bury the station so far down. I mean, I don't know if you've ever been through Heathrow, but well, you can do a lot of walking before you can get to a train. Now, hey, it's a very big airport, and it's got lots of terminals all over the place. But those sorts of things, I think, are terribly important to trying to make the transport system successful. We need to think it all through from the perspective of the passenger. What is the passenger's experience? There's a few thoughts on airports.
I did a post on LinkedIn myself a couple of months back. So I came back from my first interstate trip since COVID. I was at a conference in Melbourne, and I was keen to use the new airport link that we have in Perth when I arrived back home. And I didn't make my homework. I didn't do research on the internet, and I don't think that passengers should have to do that in order to navigate that transition from an airplane to the train. So it took me a while to find a sign pointing to the nearest train station, and then I found one sign pointing in the rough direction of a shuttle bus. But I couldn't find the bus stop. I couldn't find anything that remotely looked like a bus, let alone a shuttle bus to the nearest train station. And I ended up walking with heavy luggage for about 20 minutes in like drizzling rain. When I arrived at the train station, I was sweaty. My arms were sore for days. And I basically swore myself, I'm never going to do this again, ever. So what it turned out was that the shuttle bus that they had is actually an official public transport bus that's going return between the nearest train station and the airport. Perth has two different terminals, one for international travel, where the train station is right underneath. So apparently the connection is a lot better there. But the domestic terminal doesn't have a train station. And the nearest one was actually the one I was walking to because I knew the layout. But without the shuttle bus, it was really most inconvenient. And even with the shuttle bus, the necessity of like carrying your luggage to the bus, hauling it into the bus, which didn't have a ramp or anything, that it's just a normal public transport bus where they are not built for heavy luggage. And then again, get it out at the train station. And until you are at the train, and I still consider myself reasonably fit, you basically lost all the interest to ever do this again. And it
doesn't take much, does it? It doesn't take much to dissuade a passenger.
Yes.
One bad experience, that's it. We give it a miss. But that's why again, I'm back to Hong Kong airport railing. One of the reasons why that is so successful as an airport is its land transport, and the reason is that the project was conceived under one leadership. So the whole of the airport and its land transport access was done under one organisation ultimately, which meant that the right decisions, both for airport passengers and for other users, were made in a way. Unfortunately, in Australia, we have a situation where the Commonwealth is responsible for airports. Pretty much what happens outside the airport boundary, they're not really interested in, or they don't necessarily have authority over. Yes. State governments are responsible for land transport, and the state governments don't necessarily take decisions, that are totally in favour of the airport. They might be taking it in favour of their aerotropolis, or they might be taking it in favour of, their voters who are living, not very far away. But anyway.
Yes, and
bottom line is, I think we've got it wrong, Frank.
And there may be conflicting agendas as well. So, for instance, one of the arguments that I heard was that the airport authority in Perth is not necessarily a big fan of the airport railway line because they have a commercial interest on having cars parking on the airport car parks because they have a direct commercial benefit from that. So this kind of argument, I 100% agree with you, Peter. This kind of argument does not help to an integrated solution which really benefits everybody involved. It cannot be, because one thing will be put in the background because of the other things. And I'm just guessing that's maybe one of the reasons why I found it so hard or almost impossible to find a shuttle bus, because the signage was simply not good at all. So there was no demonstrated interest on showing passengers like myself the easiest way and clearest way to the shuttle bus. There was one sign, go this way, and then I kept going this way, and there was no other sign until I reached the train station. And for the shuttle bus, I should have taken a corner and then go 50 meters the other way, but there was no bus stop that was obvious to me. There was no bus to be seen. There's a bus over there, so maybe that's this one. None of that was the case. And and as a consequence, I had an extremely unpleasant experience that I'm definitely not repeat again. And if I compare this with other airports like Sydney, for example, I find the signage to find the train station much clearer. You can still argue whether the walking distance to the train station is perfect. It probably isn't, but at least you find it. And then once you are in the train, it takes you 10 minutes to be in the city center of Sydney, which is where most people want to go anyway. And which takes back to your point, how will the connection be in the future for Western Sydney Airport? And by rail, arguably, definitely if you want to go to Parramatta, it will be a lot longer. It will take a lot more time, and it will probably be a lot less convenient than what you have currently at Sydney Airport.
Well, certainly if the rolling stock that they roll out on that line is the same as the rolling out on Northwest Metro, it is not rolling stock that's set up for airport passengers with luggage and so on. Yeah, there'll be a fair bit of space, but no seats. So, and then you've got to get onto the metro, onto the Sydney rail system. Double-decker trains, again, not particularly well set up for people with luggage, and probably fairly full anyway. So because they're hauling people out of Western Sydney. But look, again, I did have some experience for my sins back in the 1990s. I did the independent report on Sydney Railway, and that's where a lot of my early ideas started to come from. That experience, and that was a fantastic piece of engineering to insert that railway under Sydney. But it results in the kinds of compromises that we've been talking about. Yes, you said yes, the signage is pretty good. Yes, it is. But on day one, it wasn't particularly good, and they had issues like people didn't know how to get tickets and so on. It is down a number of levels and so on, so its friction is a lot higher. But to actually put that in there as a piece of civil engineering, fantastic piece of work. And then, of course, the other thing is to justify it. It was always set up to be a hybrid railway because it's part of the metro system, and you're running trains through there that are hauling people out of the southwestern suburbs into the city. So yes, it's a great achievement. Yes, it does provide ready access. I used to say to myself when I looked out of my building in North Sydney, if I had to go to the airport, in the evening, I looked down. If the traffic was terrible on the Harbour Bridge, then I'd go and take the train. If it wasn't too bad, then I'd drive. On the way home, it'd be more convenient. So I think people make all sorts of decisions. But the one thing, if we want to make rail work for people, we've got to make it as easy as possible.
Yeah. Maybe final remark from my side. I think people have to be careful not to fall into certain planning traps. So what I can see in Sydney and where there's a potential risk for, what I mean by that is that we have two examples now where lines of the Sydney Trains network have been converted to metro operations. Epping to Chatswood was the first one, and now we have the Bankstown line conversion from Sydenham to Bankstown. Once there is a certain appetite to maybe save money for metro projects by repurposing parts of the existing Sydney Trains network, that may be a very strong driver for planning in certain directions, which may not necessarily be the most optimum way. So the next line I would see is from Glenfield to Leppington, which seems like a kind of an appendix to the Sydney Trains network, and now if that could be converted to a metro, and then it needs to be connected to Bankstown on the one side and to Western Sydney Airport on the other side. But whether that's really the best corridor to connect the Metro Southwest eventually to Western Sydney Airport, I'm not sure. Yeah, so I think people need to do their planning on a clean sheet. I can understand why that would be one option, to look at the conversion of the Leppington line. But on the other hand, it cannot be the only option simply because it worked so fantastic for Epping to Chatswood, if you know what I mean.
Well, yes, but again, here's one of the big arguments that rages around this town, and at the moment the metro people are winning, is that if you take a standard Sydney double-deck train, you've got 70% seats, 30% standing in maximum capacity. On metro, you've got the reverse. You've got 30% seated, 70% standing. And the problem is that we're really using the term metro far too loosely. What we're building are not metros; they are regional trains, because the distances between stations is sufficiently great that they're really regional suburban trains. Now, it may be that, okay, we've made that decision because we want to break the industrial power of the union, so we've got automated trains and so on. So this is another example of the state government using infrastructure for industrial relations purposes. But, nevertheless, they are nice trains, and seems to be quite a nice service, and certainly inserting rail into parts of the city that don't have rail to provide for those journeys, to give those people, I think, is really important. At the expense of wading into the debate on the Bankstown line, I mean, I did ask you a question. I asked a couple of questions. It's the only question that was asked at a conference on there, actually, and I must have shut it down. I said, well, what I don't understand is how are you going to serve the 2 stations or 3 stations off beyond Bankstown and continue to give those people a service? I mean, you're not. What are you going to do? You're going to run a train and interchange at Bankstown or what? I didn't get an answer to that question. I got head shaking. The other question I guess I asked was, given the cost of doing this, why are we not inserting rail into parts of the city that don't have rail? So, that actually it is a true, you're talking about metro network, it is actually a true overload on cities, on Sydney. I'm not really satisfied with the answer I got on that either, mostly because I didn't get an answer.
And this is probably the biggest problem of them all. You normally would think with a proper planning process, or at the end of a proper planning process, there should be answers to all of those questions. Whether you like the answers or not, it's secondary, but there should be an answer, because somebody should have thought about the pretty obvious problems that you just raised with your questions. That's my opinion anyway. So when I did a major planning for the next generation signaling here in Perth, there was not a question out there which I wasn't able to answer, because we have thought about everything. It was all written down in a business case, so that there was nothing outstanding, absolutely nothing. At the point in time with the planning done, that was the current status where questions could be answered. So then maybe let's change tack a bit and talk about high speed for a moment, because this is just getting major traction. With the new government. Well, it's not that new anymore, but after the change of federal government, there has been much more push. They have now created this new high-speed rail authority. Where do you see this going? And importantly, what I'm most concerned about is, as I said, in much of the discussion, the lack of common sense, the lack of realism. How optimistic are you that there will be a bit more common sense and realism in the upcoming future planning for this?
Yes, it's a very tricky question to ask, terribly political. I think it can operate at a whole lot of different levels, but can I say that after having started off this matter in about 1985 and having worked my way on through very many pieces of work for state governments and for the Commonwealth and for the private sector, I do title my presentations, when I speak about high-speed rail, I do title them, Let's Get Real About High-Speed Rail in Australia. And let's see if I can find the word. Okay, that's because I'm looking in my report to see if I can find what I wrote. But I think, I'll have to paraphrase it. It went a bit like this. It said that everybody in Australia is captivated by the sizzle of high-speed rail, but nobody wants to pay for the sausage. And when it comes down to it, we're we're full of ambition in Australia. We always think that we have to have the best and brightest. And we say, we wonder why it's possible to build something in Indonesia, but it's not possible in Algeria or Morocco or whatever, and it's not possible to do it in Australia. And then we forget that actually they have different political systems. They don't have infrastructure, Australia, or people doing cost-benefit assessment and all of those kinds of things. So there's always a degree of reality in Australia in terms of, we think we're a first world country. We're entitled to these things. Other people have them. Why haven't we? Now, we've been through enough phases looking at high-speed rail. It certainly led me to the position of thinking, when I started out, it was a job was a job track, and if you want to study on high-speed rail, I'd be happy to give you one. But I think you then had to, that over that period of time, that my thinking started to become real. And one thing that certainly came out was that it didn't seem to matter wherever you looked. High-speed rail ends up having to be paid for by the taxpayer, either paid for the taxpayer to start with, or bailed out by the taxpayer when it all goes wrong. There's a large litany of projects. Have a look at my website again. And, this is a few of them, a bit out of date, but there's probably a few more to add to that. So then you start to say to yourself the question, well, people are talking, when we did the piece of work back in 2001 for the Commonwealth, which was the first time the Commonwealth had really looked at this from their perspective, we're talking $55 billion for Melbourne to Brisbane. Roll the clock forward a decade, and 2014 study, that's talking about 110 billion or something like that. Actually, my mates and I used to joke that the Commonwealth could have saved themselves millions of dollars if they just factored up the numbers in our report, 2001. So the question then you start to say to yourself is, well, if the taxpayer is going to have to fund that, how does the Commonwealth government, the Minister for Transport, what does he say to the people in Western Australia? What does he say to the people in South Australia or anywhere else in Australia? Oh, we're going to sink this much money into the east coast of Australia. What do they say about that? Well, we've got cities, we've got regional rail, we've got regional places, we want to connect as well. Now, the next thing to say about it is, how does the Commonwealth government say we're going to sink that kind of money into destroying a privatised airport system? We've got private airports, we've got private airlines, and they're flying distances of about 900 kilometres, which we all know is not the right range for high-speed rail. I know that because if I go back to 1985, if I tell you a little story, 1985, I sat what was then the Menzies Hotel in Sydney, having a beer with a very senior executive from French National Railways who'd come out to Australia to talk to the promoters of the very fast train. And he said to me, what's the population of Sydney? About 3 million, I said, maybe, give or take. What is the population of Melbourne? Well, a little bit less back in those days, 2.8. What is the distance between them? Well, as the crow flies, it might be 800 kilometres, but by the time you've sort of avoided the heavy territory, maybe 900. What is the biggest city in between? Well, there's Canberra. How big is Canberra? Well, it's possibly 300,000. Oh. Is there anything else? Well, there are a couple of cities with about $30,000 to $60,000. Oh, man, he says, it will not work. Now, there you are. It's an honest opinion. Now, okay, things have moved on a bit. Things have changed. Roll the clock forward to, I suppose, about 10 years ago. There was another conference. Another senior executive from French National Railways came out and he presented a graph, which I've actually got in my PowerPoint presentation on there. He shows what is the effective what are the distances in which high-speed rail are effective? And basically saying, look, the most effective range is not at the 900-kilometre range. That's really aviation territory. But somewhere like Sydney to Newcastle, Melbourne to Geelong, or those sorts of distances, or even, in Brisbane, Sunshine Coast to Gold Coast, they're possibly even a little bit short. But they are the right, it is those regional connections around our big cities, which in Europe are high-speed lines. And I think that I'd like to go away from the term high-speed rail because I think it's sort of a distraction. It tends to make people start to say, well, what do you mean? Do you mean 200 kilometres an hour, or do you mean 350? Or what does it mean? As I say to people, we don't talk about, oh, I'm going to fly by high-speed air. We just say, well, I'm going to take a plane, I'm going to fly, because we know that the aircraft type that the aviation companies will put on that route will be a plane that's optimized for that route. So that's why I started to come to the view that what we should be looking at in Australia is how to connect our regional cities to our major cities, and to see whether or not we can change the patterns of settlement in and around our major cities. I mean, Australia, unfortunately, has a disaster when it comes to the way we settle in this country, because we've ended up with these very big cities, one in each state. So we're totally really unlike USA or even Europe, where we've got really significant regional cities. What we need to do is to reinforce those regional cities. And that way, if you like, my view on that was that would allow Commonwealth to use taxpayer funds to support all Australian cities, not just the East Coast. So that's why you would look at making improvements to deliver travel times that allow people to make a rational judgment about what mode to use, or an effective about what mode to use. And I think that led to, I was in the position of having some influence with politicians on that matter, and that did influence them to change their thinking towards looking at regional connections. They can be very fast connections. I mean, one of the things I do think is I don't think we should put any taxpayer money into upgrading. Let's face it, these are nearly 150-year-old rail corridors, most of them, because our railways were very quickly built after railways were invented in Europe. They were rolled out in Australia really quickly, and they were rolled out on alignments that were the best that the civil engineers of the day could manage. So they were pretty good at tunnelling, but, big earth moving. You didn't see the sort of big earth moving that built the Sydney-Newcastle freeway. And you'll probably never ever see that again, because I think there are better ways to do it. So, that we have railway alignments that are just not suitable for running. If you look at, and you have to take into account the terrain that exists. People just don't understand how difficult railway terrain is in and around Sydney railways. It doesn't matter which direction you go in, north, south, or west. It's very difficult country. In fact, it's a miracle that our forefathers actually managed to build anything at all. And the other thing about them is that a lot of people don't realise that those railway alignments have actually been rebuilt several times because they were built to be too steep technology of the day, and then they had to be flattened out or so on. Or in the case of the Hawkesbury River Bridge, it had to be rebuilt because the foundations were sinking and so on. So, the notion that we should now rebuild some of these alignments to deliver the sort of travel time, and the issue is not the speed of the train. The issue is what travel time do we need to deliver that will encourage people to take rail. Once we work out what the responsive patronage is to travel time, that's I don't think very few people understand that. I've been showing a graph past 25 years which showed the responsive patronage in the Sydney-Canberra corridor. And essentially what that says is that let's get cut to the chase. Until you cut the travel time in half, you basically don't get many people switching mode from car to rail or air to rail. So you've got to make a certain, a quantum leap.
Well, and this is basically not possible at all. If you look at high speed Sydney Melbourne, people are the most realistic estimate I've seen just last week in a post on LinkedIn from an overseas visitor, mind you, who's been involved in high speed systems over in Europe a lot, and he was saying realistically somewhere between 4 and 5 hours between Sydney and Melbourne, and that was probably the optimistic end of realistic. So we're not talking halving the travel time. We're talking about getting away with twice the travel time. And I just, under these circumstances, I just cannot see realistic patronage. Everybody says, yeah, I would use the railway line. And what they mean is once for their holiday, or for I've been on the railway line. So in a similar way that everybody should have been once on the Indian Pacific in their lives. Yeah, so I've traveled by train from Sydney to Perth, but I'll never do it again. So anytime I would travel for business, of course I would fly. And it's the same thing, yeah. So people can say, yeah, but it's good for the environment and so on. But then they realize that whenever they want to go from Sydney to Melbourne for a business meeting that they normally could do for a day, flying out in the morning, flying back in the evening, now taking the train means they need an overnighter at the other end. And then they are not back to their families in the evening, and all of a sudden it's not so attractive anymore. Yeah, and this is the kind of debate that I'm completely missing. The other thing you were talking about, what's in the middle. So if somebody said one possible solution to the problem could be if a township like Wagga Wagga, for example, would grow to 1 million people. But go to Wagga Wagga and talk to the people there about the outlook of becoming $1 million city. Maybe some politicians and maybe some business people might be excited about this. Everybody else will say, well, look, I haven't come here to live in 1 million people city. I've come here for the township feeling, for the small thing. I would not want my community to grow that much. And the same, I'm pretty sure, would apply to Albury or Wodonga or even Canberra. Yeah, would probably not want, or the people living in Canberra would probably not want to grow their city by a factor of 3 or something like that. So unless you start with something from scratch almost, and there were plans just north of Melbourne to do something like this, where you basically create a city big enough for 1 to 2 million people in the middle of nowhere, and then create a transport connection. Unless you do something like this, I don't see how this is going to work. And even if you did something like this, which is much closer to Melbourne than to Sydney, it would make much more sense to have a regional fast rail connection to the nearest capital city, rather than a 700 kilometer connection in the towards the other end. Yeah.
Like, I think that this is absolutely correct, Frank. But see, people get seized by these ideas, as I said earlier. I mean, the one thing we set out of the 2001 report, I wrote the words myself, so I remember pretty well, was that, high-speed rail, the whole issue of rail tends to get pushed at government by people who, they wanted to sell trains, or it's sort of, in particular, they want to sell the train that belongs to their nation, because there are lots of high-speed rolling stock manufacturers. The issue is, how do we want to live in this country? What are the pattern of settlement that this country or that the government would like to see happen? Do we want to put the brakes on metro, big metropolitan cities? I mean, we're seeing Western Sydney. I mean, we haven't talked about urban policy, but I just look at what is taking place in Western Sydney and think we've built the slums of tomorrow. It is just appalling. I look at the sort of housing options that people are having to buy. I think it's absolutely dreadful. I hope they like it. I don't like it, and I'm in a fortunate position of having to live there. But in terms of high-speed rail, of course, so I do think it's about the patterns of settlement. How do we want to live? How do we want those things to be connected? What is a rational thing to do in terms of connections? Where do we start? And so on. Now, funnily enough, there has been a proposition, which I think you obliquely referred to, about building new cities. I thought you might ask me about that, what I thought about, so I'm going to give you the answer anyway. The strange thing about it is, in one sense, it's right, because it is about the patterns of settlement. But in another sense, it's completely wrong, because it makes no sense to propose new cities. What we need to do, we've got existing cities, we need to reinforce those existing cities, because any new city, of course, you have to provide power, provide water, provide schools, provide all of that infrastructure which exists in existing cities. And this is just fairyland, because the taxpayer isn't going to do those things. But I think what we can do is to be supportive for those settlements that we already have. We can do that in a better kind of way.
I'm not really so sure, Peter. I would think that if you build something from scratch, it's arguably easier to create new infrastructure that's suitable and have the capacity for the new conurbation, compared to we have already an existing primary school in Wagga Wagga. All we need to do is to upgrade it for 5 times the number of pupils. I don't really think that will work that well. So, and if you look at how Canberra was created, that may be an example where people had a vision like how big Canberra should be and what kind of infrastructure needs to be there to support this number of people, including all the politicians from all different countries living there because of embassies and what have you. And they built something that I think accommodates this kind of population relatively well, and it's pretty much on spot for the requirements of that city. But if you try to grow, and I said this before, if you're trying to grow Canberra from the current 300,000 whatever they have got there to 1 million, you would find that all the infrastructure they've got there is no longer suitable anymore. And you can't just blow it up. You can't just multiply everything by 3. Yeah, you run out of space, you run out of, you run out of real estate and so on. So I'm not sure. Starting something from scratch where you have the space, sufficient space for the purpose that you have in mind, may be the easier solution. Yeah. And I mean, this is not something that should be paid by taxpayers. This is something for the developers. Yeah. But when you said earlier that the whole concept of high speed should maybe not be funded by taxpayers, that's the same thing. I mean, which commercial operation would want to build a high speed line in Australia unless the government gives guarantees that they cover for the fare box, so that the private operator basically makes no losses under any circumstance, which comes back to be taxpayer funded through the back door. Yeah.
Well, let me say about that is that, again, if you look at the Sydney-Canberra high-speed rail project, which that's a very interesting job. It's a shame that people have forgotten about it, because it was the only time that I know of where the private sector was invited to put forward proposals to provide a service to Canberra, to another city. And the interesting thing about that was that 4 different propositions were put forward in the end. And those 4 propositions were 2 propositions which basically either used diesel or diesel-electric traction to deliver travel times around 200 km per hour, 220, which would lead to travel times, going back to what I said earlier, the most important things travel time were of around 2 hours, and in other words, cut the travel time in half. Next proposition was to use much higher faster technology to deliver a travel time of around 80 to 85 minutes, which required massive, mostly a new alignment, whereas the previous proposals used strategic upgrading of the existing assets to deliver travel. And then somebody came along and said, well, why would you waste time doing that? Why not have Maglev travel at 550 kilometers an hour, totally new separate alignment, so on. Now, when you actually plot travel time delivered by those three options, well, there's four options, I should say, against the cost of the proposal. And these were the costs that were actually quoted in the Sydney Morning Herald, so I didn't have access to any privy information. But you get the most wonderful curve, which is basically looks like this. Oh, you can't see that, but it's the law of diminishing returns. So for every minute, below 2 hours, every minute that you want to save costs you more and more. And yet, the interesting thing is that you barely get any more people using the service. So what's the point of it? So one of the things that I have always spoken of is the need to find the right box for your project, the right combination of travel time versus the infrastructure cost, then back figure what technology do you need to deliver that. And I think there was some really good information that came out of Sydney. These were propositions which, obviously at the higher end, when you start to get out to $3.5 billion, $6 billion, they would have had their hand out to the government. At around $1.5 billion to deliver a 2-hour travel time, that was a consortium that I was involved in. We reckon that we could actually cover it. We could deliver that. But you know what happened, Frank? In the tender evaluation? Well, the minister said, oh, well, we don't think you're fast enough. Oh, that's really curious, Minister. We didn't know that this was a competition. You want fast? We can give you fast. What we thought was this was at no net cost to government. In other words, not having to tap the government on the shoulder for the money. So that's why we delivered a service of the structure that we did. So you see, in Australia, we have all this kind of crazy stuff going on. We certainly have a very big political over the whole subject. Now, that's a long way of asking where do I think we're currently at. I think where we're currently at is, well, this government has actually delivered, all of the governments, back in 2018, was that when the previous election was? They all said that they would set up a high-speed rail board. The Liberal Party didn't set up a high-speed rail board. I was desperately hoping they would, because I thought I might get appointed to it. But they didn't. This government has done what it said it would do. It said it would set up a high-speed rail board. I don't doubt the enthusiasm of the Prime Minister for high-speed rail, but then I haven't doubted any of our previous ministers' enthusiasm for it. I'm not sure whether or not he will be tempered by realism. I hope he will. And I'm encouraged to think that this government will do that because they haven't trashed previous governments' proposition for faster regional rail. And the second thing is that they have said they're going to focus on Sydney and Newcastle. When I was asked some years ago, where should all this start, I said Sydney and Newcastle. The reason is because that is the most heavily used rail corridor in the whole of the Commonwealth of Australia. And if you want to know the reason why the French built the first TGV line, which was Paris to Lyon, the reason was because they ran out of capacity on the classic railway. And if they were going to build something, well, they built it to the best standard they could build it to. So I think Sydney-Newcastle is the right place to start. It has the potential to change the patterns of settlement in the corridor. The really interesting question in my mind for Sydney-Newcastle is that, yep, we can certainly see people commuting out of the region. The question is, will we see people commuting into the region? So the extent to which it's two-way travel as opposed to be a tidal flow out in the morning, back in the evening. Spin brought a cup of coffee. How nice. That really to me is a big question. I've spent a lot of my career looking at Sydney Newcastle. I started my career as an engineer down on the Hawkesbury River Bridge, so I know a lot about the Hawkesbury River and the problems of getting across all that country. I personally walked through that country. It's very difficult, and so it is a big challenge. It has got a really big number attached to it if you want to deliver the travel times.
But while it's a big challenge, it's also the most realistic challenge. I mean, one, you said that Sydney Newcastle is probably the most suitable of all the connections around Sydney for something that I would call regional fast rail rather than high speed. And if they can't manage to build an efficiently working railway line at higher speed between Sydney and Newcastle, they don't have a shot going into Canberra anyway, because the terrain is pretty much the same, if not easier. So I don't know. I think I agree with you that Sydney Newcastle is an ideal starting point for that new high-speed commission, where they can really put their teeth into it and make that work. And once this works properly, then I think people will have a much better idea how realistic it is to have something like this on a bigger scale, which is going all the way down to Melbourne. Or up to
Canberra is relatively easier. I've looked at that. I've looked at that on quite a few occasions. So the really interesting thing of Canberra is that the profile of the terrain is almost identical to Seville to Madrid. You have a city down on the coastal plain, Sydney. You run along the coastal plain, and then you have this almost continuous climb for a steep climb up to a plateau, and then you run along the plateau. So Canberra has its difficulties. I think part of the problem is people kept on adding bits in to try and knock a few minutes off, which cost a lot of money to do. Having looked at Sydney Canberra on several occasions, for the private sector, there are ways to deliver a much better travel time if we are realistic about it. The funny thing is that even the politicians, Canberra, I've got a letter that I wrote to the press. It was in response to something that was said by the Canberra Times. It said, your editorial comment on Sydney to Canberra rail travel, that improvements to the existing rail line could easily deliver faster travel at a fraction of the cost of the endlessly debated high-speed rail link, is probably the most sensible assessment made in any Australian newspaper, let alone the Canberra press. Now, Frank, one thing I've learned in life is if you want to get published in a newspaper, you've got to suck up to the editor. So this having not only led many studies sponsored by government, but also private sector in 1998. Unfortunately, projects which have proposed to do exactly as you suggest are invariably seen as yesterday's technology and systems. The punchline to my letter was this. It said, Australians, it would seem, would far rather do absolutely nothing than do something sensible, achievable, affordable, deliverable. And that is precisely what we've done for the past 20 years. Now, that's really the issue, is that we always got this big appetite in Australia that we deserve something better instead of doing something that actually would deliver something worthwhile at not such a big cost. And it's a problem because, unfortunately, we do have very interventionist politicians who think they know best. So anyway, so to get back to your point, I am very hopeful that they have appointed a board of sensible people who will recognise when they're being conned, if you like, or being told to do something which is really kind of crazy. And I hope that board is, will take a very get real approach to this subject. And I hope that what we will see in Australia, in and around Australian cities, are much better travel times to those regional centres. And I think that that to me is the goal, because it's something that can be achieved in and around all Australian cities, and isn't just a huge lick of money being spent in one place.
Yeah. I think those were perfect final words to wrap this up. So thank you very much. I'm aware that you spent much more time with me than we originally planned for. So thanks for your time and thanks for your insight as well. It remains to be seen. I mean, even if your wish to get on one of those high-speed boards seems to not have been fulfilled, I'm still hopeful that people with so much transport experience will be at least consulted or listened to at some point in the process. So because I tend to say normally people don't get more stupid by listening to intelligent people. Yeah, whether they implement the things or not, that's up to them at the end of the day. But at least they heard different opinions, qualified opinions that may lead to a better overall result. So let's hope for this, I guess.
Well, I hope so, Frank. I mean, sort of I'm at the stage of life where I'm running out of runway, to use an expression, and it would be nice to be useful, and it's always a bit flattering, isn't it, to be influential? So we'll see. Look, thanks for inviting me to talk to you. I'm happy to do it again if there's another topic you want to have a shot at. What you might care to do for me, though, is perhaps give a plug to my website, where
I will definitely do that. So for the listeners, I thought about this myself after you mentioned your website for the third time or so, and probably with good justification. I will definitely put a link to your website into the show notes for this podcast, so that every listener can have a look at this and see what in more detail what your positions have been on topics of public interest in the transport sector in Australia. So definitely do that. Thanks very much. And for all the listeners, I hope you enjoyed this episode and the insight that was conveyed here by Peter. If you like that podcast episode, also please check out the other ones, and most importantly, tell your friends and colleagues about this. And until next time, keep it simple. Bye for now.
Right. Thanks, Frank.
Hi, it's Doc Frank here. Real quick, I want to let you know about one of the best CBTC trainings in the world, if not the very best, but you always need to be careful with superlatives. It's the CBTC Kickstarter online course. It consists of 30 video lessons. That's the 3 with the 0. In total, over 11 hours of training content, talking about everything from the basics of CBTC, current standards, the benefits of CBTC, the key functionality of it, the supply industry, application tips and tricks, lessons learned, do's and don'ts, case studies, arguably the most comprehensive training that you can find anywhere on the topic of CBTC. A few additional things that make learning easier for you that you may not find on any other online courses. One of them being an immersion plan that helps guiding you through the training course and progress it in a finite period of time instead of just having it sit there for months and months on end. There is access to an online study group where you can connect with other students who are doing that training course at the time and form learning groups. And after the training, you will not be on your own. There is an alumni community that allows you to ask questions about the course content on an ongoing basis. So it's basically education for life. You can register on my training portal, which is docfranktraining.podia.com/ CBTC Kickstarter online 2023. I repeat that, docfranktraining.podia.com/CBTC Kickstarter online 2023. Hi, it's Doc Frank again. I hope you liked today's episode. I like to keep it as simple as possible, so I only have one single request for you. If you like this podcast, please tell your friends and colleagues about it. That's all I want, because that's a service that I'm providing to the industry, and I would like as many people as possible to listen to this podcast and learn something from it. So please share, and until next time, keep it simple and bye for now. Thank you for listening.